Doctor Harris, usted sabe que llevamos 6 años tratando de poner luz en el yacimiento de Iruña Velella. Usted ha conocido el yacimiento, ha visto el trabajo, los cuadernos de campo del equipo anterior, Eliseo Gil y de Afilloy, y ha visto el trabajo del equipo actual de la Universidad del País Vasco. Ha visto el sector, no recuerdo exactamente, creo que es el sector número 6, que fue destruido por la excavadora, con el actual equipo de Iruña Velella. ¿Qué piensa sobre la cuestión? ¿Es la arqueología una ciencia o a lo mejor es algo que hay que recurrir al tarot?
I have to be careful what I say. I might be in court tomorrow. It was a privilege to be in the Basque Country a few years ago and to be acquainted with the controversy there. It's my view that it's an unfortunate controversy for archaeology in general, and that really it should be, everyone should sit down and go over everything with a fine-tooth comb. When I looked at the report on the site, what I could say was that it looked like the site had been extremely well excavated stratigraphically. Stratigraphic sequences were made. And I come back to the point that the stratigraphic sequence is the testing pattern for what happened on the site. And and it also is where you lock in the artifacts that you take out of deposits into the stratigraphic sequence. So an issue like this, I think one has to go back to basics with some outside experts and relook at the excavation, look at the stratigraphic sequences that were made, look at the artifacts that were found, go and see where they said they found them in the stratigraphic sequence, and begin to get a true sense of whether the placement of everything was where it belonged. So this is an interesting example of how if you do your stratigraphy correct, and if you understand how to dig stratigraphically and to record stratigraphically, you should be able to go anywhere in the world and look at reports or records and see whether archaeologists are doing their job correct or not. That's part of the matrix is sort of like a double entry bookkeeping for accounting. You can become an auditor and to see whether the experiment was done on a particular dig was done correctly or not. And not out of that other things fall. So this has to be looked at in detail, as you should look in detail and back to the stratigraphy for any situation that's a controversy in archaeology.
Dice que, bien, él ha visto el sitio, él ha visto los trabajos de campo del yacimiento de Iruña Velella, que a él le pareció correcto y bien hecho, pero que la gente tiene que ir a mirar y a discutir los detalles de los estratos y los detalles de técnicos arqueológicos para realmente tomar una decisión, y no tiene que salir la discusión del terreno estrictamente científico. Y esto es lo que ha dicho y ha repetido otra vez. Ha vuelto a repetir que los que saben inglés la han visto, que hay que ir a los estratos, hay que ir a revisar técnicamente, y que esto es un ejemplo técnicamente de los hallazgos, y que esto es un ejemplo de lo que puede ocurrir en todas partes del mundo, y para lo que sirve la matriz suya y de definir los hallazgos de los estratos.
Juan Zozaya. I'll speak in English for your benefit.
That's kind, thank you.
Now, make a risk of me in Spanish afterwards. I'm not really going to ask a question. I just simply want to thank you, because I was one of the first who used your system in 1977 in Spain.
Give him a hand.
So I've come to thank the boss. And
Yes.
what I find that is very interesting of your system is that most probably we're going to be able to apply it to cultural evolution in landscapes.
Absolutely. Yes. I should have. Sorry. Oh, you tell them yes first. Yes.
No, había dicho al profesor Harris que aparte de que venía a agradecerle, porque yo fui de los primeros que utilizó, si no el primero, que utilizó el sistema Harris en España, el año 77, que lo interesante de su sistema es que muy posiblemente se puede aplicar estratos culturales en el estudio de paisaje, desde el punto de vista arqueológico.
Yes, what the professor is saying is absolutely correct. And of course, surfaces expanded to a generality, a landscape. And so when you're reconstructing your archaeological site in terms of its landscape, you're reconstructing the surfaces. You're building up all the various surfaces of the site through time. And that's one of the most important jobs you have to do. Now, in order to do it and get it all in good order, you have to analyze the artifacts. So this is where it becomes really heavy duty and difficult, and where today you're so lucky to have the computers, because you're eventually going to be dealing with the permutations of stratigraphic sequences. And I will demonstrate to you very simply what I'm talking about. These two items are in superposition. Not a problem. No matter what happens, no matter what the artifacts say chronologically, these two are in superposition, and this is under this one here. So if all the artifacts dating-wise here contradict this one, then you've got to look at the next one. You've got to look at the one underneath to try and figure out whether everything in here is useless because it came down the tree root or whatever, and so on. And this applies to anything. A lot of people look at radiocarbon dates and think, oh, this is perfect and so on, but the fact of the matter is it's based on portable artifacts, to a degree, which can move. Now, so I have here on this desk, I have a multilinear stratigraphic sequence of a dozen or so artifacts and so on. So this is in superposition to this piece of glass here. It's not in superposition to this. So which one of these in absolute time is later or earlier? And if this one's later, it pushes, and we're talking about a deposit now, it pushes its surface up with it. So it pushes the surface up to a higher point. Or it may be like that. Well, and then you can have these two. You know, these two are later than this, or that's later than those two, or whatever. And we did one little, we took a tomb of 13 layers, and then we flipped it upside down and made them all interface surfaces. But anyway, for that one 13-layer stratigraphic unit, there were 252 possible permutations of all the different deposits that weren't in superposition. And this is where the fun really begins, and this is where you people are so lucky, you younger people, to have computers to do analysis for you, and so on. But in reconstructing the surface on an archaeological site, it can't be done just through the surfaces and the deposits alone, because you need the information of the artifacts to push or reduce in absolute time the surfaces. And on a small site, this is not so much of a problem. On some sites, you have indicators such as a a Roman tessellated floor, which clearly is going to be it's going to put a lock on things and so on. But this is a real problem for archaeology, because in the old days, you get this, and the director would come in. Oh, Roman coin, it must be 3rd century. What was never really done was to start to stack all the things up, because they didn't have the stacks to stack them against except for section drawings. So, in other words, Richard Rees, friend of mine working at Carthage, analyzing coins, he had a matrix diagram, and he had all the coins, and most of the coins were absolutely useless for dating purposes, because they had moved around so much, and they were residual or this, that, and another, and so on. But you only come to that realization by looking at the whole column. So you can't reconstruct the landscape on a complex site without the help of the analysis of the artifacts. So your first job is to record all these surfaces individually. And this is why, again, I mentioned notebooks. When I started on that Lewis Brook Street site, I had 70 notebooks. What I should have done with the notebooks is taken them to the printer and chopped the binding off of each notebook so I could move the records around. Because as you're digging, you're not necessarily fully digging everywhere in absolute stratigraphic order. So you want to record your surfaces. Well, you do record your surfaces individually. You want to record your deposits on individual pieces of paper, because then when you rearrange things into different phases and so on, you can just move your information. Now, of course, you do that on the computer now. It's not a problem. But so we were locking in our stratigraphic information just by the format of the recording. But anyway, it is the most important point. I think we don't appreciate the degree to which every archaeological site is a landscape site. It's a landscape entity. And it has surfaces on which people lived, just like we live on the surfaces of the landscape. So I thank you for that thing which I'd forgotten to mention, but it's critical to the whole business. And in the end, one should be able to line up period surfaces in Tarragona with Madrid with somewhere else, and so on and so on. Not that they're going to connect. Although some of our stratigraphic units do connect. If you take Highway 66 across the United States, and then you go from Alaska down to Patagonia, you're going on stratigraphic units that Mother Nature never created, but which connect sites over several continents. And so anyway, it's an exciting business as far as I'm concerned, and even more so now because you have GIS, you have 3D scanning, you can record these surfaces quickly and efficiently and so on, and have them ready for when you've then done your analysis of your artifacts based upon your stratigraphic sequence. And all that happens with the sequence usually is that it grows in length based upon your absolute time scale. So it might be quite compact when you've just done it, but then when you start putting in lines across the surfaces for absolute dates, then it stretches up. And you might have a whole period where nothing happened at all, and so on. I can go on all night. No, some more questions? Yes.
Hello, Professor Harris. Thank you for being here. It's
You're welcome.
Pleasure to have you here alive. And I would like, to ask you a very specific question, and it is, when you come back to Winchester and you have to re-excavate the 17 notebooks and the 700 plans, how do you come to the idea that the surfaces are the key to understanding the stratification? I mean, is it based on your geological knowledge, or is there anything that you find in those notebooks that makes you say, Eureka, this is the key?
No.
Thank you.
No, certainly not in the notebooks. The reason being that when the matrix was invented, I was still in the old mode of thinking. That is, I was an archaeologist. And what do archaeologists do? They dig things up. And surfaces don't exist unless you put them in a plan. So they're very easy to dig up. And so the surface business eventually came along because I couldn't unlock some of the relationships in the stratigraphic sequence because we weren't giving value to the surfaces. So, for example, here we have, this is a medieval pit, and it's cut down through Roman deposits and so on. So the bottom layer in this pit is on top of, say, 14th century is on top of a Roman layer of 1,000 years before or something. If you don't give value to the surface that is the actual whole, then this is always locked in relationship to that. And because of that, you cannot get your sequence to stand up correctly. One of the things that I keep meaning to buy, and I started looking in toy shops this morning, but when we were growing up, we had these little toys that were animals, and you pressed the bottom of the base of the animal, and the animal fell down. Any of you remember those? Anyway, that's what you find, the fallen down animals, what you find when you're doing an archaeological dig. But as you're children, the moment you let the base off, the animal stood back up again. So the physical relationships became time relationships because the head of the giraffe was lying down like that on top of the base, all of a sudden goes up into its correct position. So if you give this surface of the inside of this glass its correct stratigraphic value, and you give it a number, and you follow the rules, that surface takes its relationship from the highest level through which it was cut. So if you think of the inside of the glass as a little almost invisible plastic layer, and it's cut from here, and you pull it, all of these deposits go up to the top here. And the relationship between the physical deposit in the bottom and the Roman layer is broken. In relative time, it's true, but in the stratigraphic time, that relationship becomes redundant, and you have to get rid of it in order to get a clarified stratigraphic sequence. Otherwise, all you're doing is trying to produce in a diagram a three-dimensional section across the whole site, which is almost impossible to do. So I was realizing that there were certain problems with this, and it was through discussions with colleagues where I said, look, what's going on here? We can't, these things they can't get freed up. And then, as I said, a colleague of mine said, look, we've started drawing every surface, even surfaces of deposits, not just these special negative surfaces, and all of a sudden that was the key to the whole thing. But if you don't give, you can get away with not numbering the surface of a deposit, although I don't recommend it, because at some point you should have, in your periods of your site, you should have all deposits in period 1, if you will, or period 2, because the first phase should be natural, say, period 2. So all your even numbers should be deposit periods and disuse periods, and all your odd numbers should be nothing but surfaces, so boxes with surfaces in them. So it was that became the key to being able to make a true stratigraphic sequence, because what you're doing is basically, if you're just looking at it as a section, you're blowing the section apart, which you have to do, which you'll do sooner or later, because you'll blow it apart when you stick in your artifact data, because things will lift off of each other. So it was not in those notebooks. What was good about those notebooks is they created a massive problem of how to go and take something that's been excavated and make a final report. when no one knew that sorting it out meant you had to make the stratigraphic sequence. And we were still doing it verbally. So literally, you took a notebook and you opened and it said this layer is over that one and that one's over that one. And you thought, well, this belongs to this phase. So you rewrote it on a piece of paper. But by the time you turned a couple of pages, you couldn't remember what was over what. Particularly when you had thousands of these things, forget it. If you didn't have the diagram, you were sunk. And so I spent 3 years working on that site, and I have to say that I probably didn't resolve, and I probably can't, because they didn't do enough consistent recording the stratigraphic information so you can end up with a decent stratigraphic sequence. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you again, Mr. Harris. It's been a pleasure listening to you talking so clearly, especially because it must be no easier to talk about your life and your hard work after 40 years, more than 40 years, in just 1 hour. So thank you again. And I would like to ask you about the future, not the past. Something
Yes.
weird in an archaeologist, right? I would like to know what is your next challenge? Sorry about that.
Well, I have to say that one of my great disappointments was that when I went home to Bermuda and took a job running the museum, I didn't really do any more digging, which is a pity because I loved the digging. It's wonderful, wonderful stuff. And but as time goes on, as I'm sure the director of the National Museum will appreciate, you become an administrator. And so we've done a lot of archaeology at Bermuda, but it's with younger people, field schools, and so on. And my job is to come and look over the trench and say, oh, wonderful, oh, great stuff, and go away and have a drink. And when I came back home to Bermuda, the museum had just been started in a 10-acre fort in 1974, and I started in 1980. We've recently taken over another 6 acres of grounds, fortifications, and beautiful historic buildings built out of the local limestone. We've had the museum renamed as the National Museum of Bermuda because we've been doing the work of a national museum. So I now have more historic buildings to restore and raise the funds for. I will say that you have to understand that in Bermuda and a lot of places in the United States, you don't work for the government. We're private enterprises and so on. Archaeologically, one of the things I would like to do, aside from encouraging anybody who wishes to be encouraged and getting more languages on the website, it would be fun to have a fellowship and then travel the world and go and look at archaeological sites in as many countries as one could, and also look at the records and do a global audit of what archaeologists are doing in terms of recording their site. And this is not to criticize people. This is just to say, look, what are we doing? This business of archaeology is very, very important. A friend of mine who is an archaeologist in Australia used to say that as far as he was concerned, society was a big bulldozer with a big bucket, and archaeology was the cutting edge of the bucket. And then no other profession has allowed us to learn more about ourselves as human beings in the last 150 years than has archaeology. Now, that might be a great claim, but the point is we're in a very, very important business, and this information in the earth is entrusted to us to capture as no one else can, because it's our profession. And our profession we're digging is to be stratigraphers, to take that site apart correctly, record it so we can reconstruct the landscape, we can analyze the artifacts, and we can recover a big chunk of history, because that is our primary responsibility, aside from the fact that it's one of the most exciting things that I think we can do.
Okay, good afternoon again. Thank you for coming up. My question is about the future as well. After you did your thesis about metrics near the new archaeology, today in the 21st century, do you think that the metrics needs a new revision, a new reading made by new archaeologists or by new young people as here today? I mean, after 40 years. And thank you.
It is a very good question. The answer is twofold. One, that the matrix system, if you want to call it that, and by that I mean not just making the diagrams, but abiding by the laws of archaeological stratigraphy, excavating stratigraphically, locking in your artifacts stratigraphically, so on and so on and so on. It was true from the time it came into being, and by that I mean it's true in the scientific sense. It's a system that is true. If you put information into it that doesn't come out right, it's not the problem of the system, it's the problem of the information. And the fact that I'm here today, I think is testament that the system continues to carry through. Where the revision, not the revisions to the system will come, but the expansion of its use. And this continues, I wouldn't say on a daily basis, but I'm in Bermuda, I'm a bit sort of out of it in a way. You know, you don't hear about everything that's going on and all the wonderful work that a lot of people are doing. But the fact of the matter is that when on the website, if people download, we ask them if they'll say something. And if you write that, I'll delete it, but we ask them to say something. So, of course, you get people saying, I'm starting to work on rock art. I'm having problems with standing buildings. I'm a paint analysis, of which there have been several papers published in Spain on using the matrix for analyzing coats of paint. In other words, if you think about the range of activities that an archaeologist could be involved in analysis of, a lot of them are stratigraphic. And so you can apply the matrix to that because you're simply going by the principles of relative time, which came first, and then arranging a diagram in relationship to it. So I would say that the fact that this hall is full tonight means that the validity of what was written 40 years ago is still very valid, but that there are expansions, not of the basic system, but of its use. It's being applied to more and more things because it's a very, very useful tool, or so it's proved to be. I don't think you can revise the system because it's so simple to begin with. And again, you're only asking one question between these two. Which in relative time is earlier? You make your decision, it goes on to the diagram. So we can meet afterwards and sort you out. Thank you very much for that question. That's a very good one. Well, look, thank you. Thank you all very much. No one else wants to say anything? Thank you all very much. It's always a pleasure to be here in situations like this, particularly with the younger generations. And it's a great honor you do to me to come out and listen to an old warhorse waffling on about something that happened 41 years ago. But you're archaeologists, after all, and that's what you should be doing.